Okay, so everyone, welcome to this clinical session. So we've done a number of these in past SNOMED meetings with various focuses. So this time we've decided to focus down in some ways on cancer care. And we have 4 speakers, so think of this in terms of similar to a clinical webinar that we run normally, except rather than 1, you get 4 for the price of 1 this time. The 4 presenters you can see on the screen here, I'm not going to introduce them. They can introduce themselves as we go through. Just a kind of a bit of public relations in some ways. So don't forget, we have the Snomed Expo, which starts tomorrow. So there's 1 day to go. Be there. We have quite a busy schedule, lots going on, lots of interesting presentations I'm sure you'll find very useful and stimulating. So if you haven't registered yet, please do. In terms of, I suppose, the clinical component, if you like, there are a number of streams in the expo. The one which is probably pertinent to yourselves more than any other, we have one called SNOMED CT in clinical settings and clinical research, which has been sponsored by Distal. But have a look, you're entitled to join any of the streams at all, but certainly have a look at the clinical stream. I dare say you will find it useful. And just a kind of another bit of advertising, if you like. We run a number of web series. So I pull together some on clinical areas of interest, if you like. The next one is on the 17th of November. We're going to focus down on epilepsy and some of the work that we're doing with the International League Against Epilepsy and improving SNOMED content, or improving and updating epilepsy content. So if you're free, if that interests you, then obviously go down here. You can just register. All the web series are free of charge, so they're not chargeable, but please come along. The other 2 web series, we run one around areas of research, which is run by my colleague, Susie Roy, which literally has some eminent leaders, I'll call them, from academia that are doing research involving SNOMED, also very interesting and certainly with a clinical slant, if you like. And then finally, we run the implementation web series, which is run by my colleague, Linda, and her team. They tend to focus down on the more practical issues, if you like, of using SNOMED. But any of them, like I say, they're advertised on our website on snomed.org. Have a look. If they're of interest to you, please register and join. So without further ado, if you like, let's get on with this. So let me just pop the agenda up and then I'll just talk you through what we're going to do. So in terms of today, we're running a session basically for 3 hours. I'm not going to keep you in your seats for 3 hours, so we'll have a break in the middle. Broadly speaking, it takes you on a journey, if you like, through cancer care and the use of SNOMED in cancer care. So we'll start off with an overview of cancer synoptic reporting from a European perspective. Internally within the SNOMED community, we're doing some work on cancer synoptic reporting, which we're going to report back on. Then we get into a bit more of a practical session, if you like, in terms of how cancer registries are using SNOMED and really get into some of the nuts and bolts, if you like, of how to use SNOMED. And then finally, I suppose, although in some ways, I suppose looking forwards, it has more importance in some ways. But look at the way SNOMED supports some of the work going on towards research and looking at cancer research, but also including, which is kind of inevitable these days, including COVID. So without further ado, the other thing to say, yes, is each of the sessions will run for about 30 minutes, then we'll have time for questions at the end. If you have questions as you're going along, you'll see on your toolbar there is a Q&A box. if you could put any questions you have in the Q&A box, myself and my colleagues will endeavour to moderate and raise the questions as we go along. So hopefully by the end of the session, we'll have answered all your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. So our first speaker is Eckhard Huer from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. So Eckhard, I will hand over the screen to you.
So I do I get this to work?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, you can see the my entire presentation now.
Yeah, we can. Excellent. Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm very excited to be with you today, and I'm working as a pathologist here in Lausanne, in French-speaking part of Switzerland, and I would like to talk to you about synoptic reporting, so a specific type of structuring cancer reports and pathology from our perspective. And European is maybe a bit exaggerated, so I do not claim to be representative of everything that happens in Europe in these terms, but nevertheless, I think there is a few common and important points. For one thing, we don't work in English, but in a variety of different languages. Sometimes there are, such as in Switzerland, several languages even within the same country, or we share a language among different countries. And in the majority of these countries, there's no single or central institution that either mandates or at least suggests specific templates for this type of reporting. So a couple of common challenges, I guess, arrive in many European countries at least. If I talked to my colleagues in pathology about what actually a diagnosis is, I guess I would receive for many a definition a bit like this, that, well, in our diagnostic line, we kind of try to condensate the most important and the most salient features of what we see under the microscope when we look at this specimen. That seems to make a lot of sense, but actually, if you think about it for a moment, maybe it doesn't, because there's a lot of things like this dinosaur shape or this smiling face, which are very impressive if you or very evident when you look at the slide, but which are not actually of any clinical or otherwise diagnostic importance. So we have to modify this a bit. And nevertheless, it's true that what we do in pathology is actually a massive kind of data compression, because we start with huge amounts of data, such a full slide scan, as you can see here, of a reasonably big specimen that's easily in the order of magnitude of 1 gigabyte per slide, and there with immunostainings and multiple blocks, this may account to dozens of gigabytes for a single case, maybe even not for a very complex one. And at the end, the product that is derived from this is a diagnostic report, which, if it's long, is in the order of magnitude of 1,000 words or a few thousand characters. So you can do the calculation yourself if you want. Anyway, this is a massive data compression, but we can't just naively extract the most evident morphological features, but it matters what's in there. We have to process it, and as we've seen before, the dinosaur shape, if it happens, is not actually of much concern. But we need to find what actually clinically prognostically matters. So, I mean, this is in German, the actual text is not important. So this is an actual report. I copy and pasted from my previous institution. So a report would look like this, and you can imagine that it's not so easy to retrieve data items from such a text. I mean, here I tried it a bit in color coding. So, for example, there's the specimen type, there is the site of the resection, there's the histological type of the lesion, there is the question of infiltration of blood vessels or lymphatic vessels, the margin, etc. So a lot of different data items which are a bit haphazardly distributed over all this text. So obviously this is not a already for or not even for purpose of cancer registry or more sophisticated things, but even just for discussion in a tumor board, this is not the ideal and not a very straightforward format in order to allow for retrieval of these data. And so it's not only about, when we look at this traditional narrative reports in a continuous text, it's not only about identifying the individual data elements, but also about the interpretation. And this is an actual description of an immunohistochemical staining I found in a report. And well, you can actually very well imagine again what the pathologist saw on the microscope. So this was a p53 immunostaining, and well, most neoplastic cells were positive. The intensity was variable, mostly it was faint. So you can imagine what the pathologist saw, but to know what this actually medically means is by no means straightforward. So this was maybe not the most stringent way to put it, but actually in this other examples, in this other example, we can see that something that looks complicated may actually have a very well-defined meaning. So what is described here is that neutrophils were incubated with patient serum, and one did immunofluorescence microscopy and saw a perinuclear staining. So you can actually understand what has been done, and this is just a bit of a cumbersome way to put it, because usually we would be used to receive such a result in a form like this. This is actually a lab value. This is a description of the result of ANCA, which is actually positive in a pattern that we would describe as p-ANCA. So this shows that even if the actual microscopic examination is a bit complex, you can often put the result in fairly simple ways. And this kind of observation is probably historically behind the concept of synoptic reporting. The most complete definition is by the College of American Pathologists, and according to this definition, synoptic reporting is defined by two facets. For one thing, it's about completeness. So per cancer type, there is a list of so-called required data elements, and in a synoptic report, you want to have all of these data elements present. Some of them may be optional, so you may or may not report them. Some may be conditional, so they only apply in certain situations, but according to all these rules, for each case, it should be clear what has to be in the report. So this is the one aspect of synoptic reporting, and the other one is, just as we saw before with the ANCA, a lab result-like format. So things get much easier to interpret if you have different items in different lines, and a so-called paired format, which consists of the description of the required data element and the response. So in the previous example, the anchor and the result, or any histopathological feature and the actual result for this case. CAP just requires that, with a few exceptions, separate data elements should be in separate lines. Otherwise, there's very few restrictions, and you can there's a lot of flexibility you can use and still comply with the CAP requirements. CAP distributes per cancer type protocols which are freely available, so you can even use them as Word documents and fill in the Word documents. They are mandatory for CAP accredited pathology laboratories, and as I already mentioned, CAP is very flexible in terms of accepted formats of all this. Well, synopsis means just overview, and as a bit of a cultural reference, the synoptic gospels are those that can be arranged in such a format, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they all have more or less similar information in them, and if you arrange them nicely in columns like this, you actually can very nicely see the similar structure. So this is a bit historically the background of the term synoptic. When one deals with this as a pathologist, it gets very rapidly clear that this is quite a useful thing. So here I have twice the same diagnostic information, once in a traditional narrative format and once in synoptic format. And now you see that while the data elements are actually the same one, it gets much easier to find a specific information. So if you're the radio-oncologist, you may look for one data element, and the medical oncologist may, or the surgeon may look for other data elements which are most important to their part of the management, and you can easily imagine that with a format like this, it gets much easier to actually retrieve this information. And also, if you use this, you have like an inbuilt checklist, so you are much less prone to forget something when you prepare a report. Just the format, however, may not be enough. That brings us maybe a bit back to the dinosaur example from before. So these are 3 nuclear stains we use in pathology, and so you could imagine that for all of these stains, in a given case, 15% of cells are positive. However, just reporting this as 15% positive may not be very useful, because depending on the type of marker, this may have a very different meaning, and this may also, for some markers, depend on the specific antibody or on modification of the protocol in a given laboratory. So while this is lab value-like, this is not really helpful. What you have to do is to provide context, to extract the really relevant features and then report them. And for example, for this marker MUM1 we use in classification of lymphomas, 15% would be below the usual cutoff, so it would be more appropriate to report it as negative. For P53, 15% would, in the way most tests are set up, would most likely indicate a tumor without a TP53 mutation. And for Ki67, well, this would correspond to the proliferation index. One would have to keep in mind, however, that depending on the tumor type, a different number or different other rules for determining this percentage of tumor cells would have to be applied in order to reach this result. So this is by no means new, and there's a plethora of studies that show that synoptic reporting actually works. So in almost all examples and also in meta-analyses, this has been shown to improve completeness of the reports, and this is interestingly, this is not only true when cases are handled by non-subspecialists, but even if cases are handled by people which are already very specialized in a certain field, completeness improves with synoptic reporting. There are studies that show that the way results are put matters, because if you just use a bit random terms in according to each pathologist's discretion, there is a significant source for misunderstanding, and satisfaction is generally high when synoptic reporting is implemented very much among clinicians. For pathologists, recurring issue is a bit that this is more time consuming than traditional reports, likely because reports will be more complete. So if you want to get started with this, there are nowadays two major institutions that provide protocols for synoptic cancer reporting: the International Collaboration for Cancer Reporting and the College of American Pathologists. And these protocols are available freely on the respective websites in PDF and usually also in Word format, so you can work with this. There is not only the list of the parameters and the result, but also a lot of documentation along these, so explanation what for this specific tumor type is actually the criterion, precisely the criterion to render a positive or a negative result. There are a few differences. So CAP is longer in the field. As a result of this, it's very comprehensive, so it's hard to find a cancer type for which there is not a CAP protocol, and they, over the time, they have developed a very impressive way they manage the updates. So these protocols are also timely, and it's can anticipate that this will continue in the future. However, they are available only in English. A potential advantage for those working in English is that there is a number of commercially available software solutions, so you don't have to deal very much with all the technical details. They are free to use with some restrictions if you want to have a deeper software implementation. ICCR also provides a growing list of protocols. It's more recent in the field, so it's maybe not so clear or evident that how they will manage with the updates in future. And some of the protocols, being this being an international thing, some of the protocols are now available in Spanish, Portuguese, French. To my knowledge, there are plans for other languages, but not yet available. And also in these three languages, it's only a part of the protocols that are available. To my knowledge, so far, no software interfaces for integrating this in your local pathology information system are available. So when we talk about a European or continental European country context, a few things are a bit different than in the United States. So there's neither an obligation, and in most countries, also not really a lot of support on a national level if you want to implement this. There are, in most countries, no publicly or commercially available IT solutions for this, so you have to do the work on your own. There is one very important example. This is the Palcha Foundation in the Netherlands, which has been doing things like this for decades, and which is very much a front runner. But in terms of language compatibility, again, we are a bit then limited in benefiting from this in other countries. I already mentioned that the availability in other languages than English is very limited. So as a result, if you want to do synoptic reporting in pathology, it's usually a local thing, and this is really a heavy burden for both implementation and updates. So most departments I know of do this only for a small number of organs, and there is regrettably little information on how much this is actually and how wide spread the actual application is in Europe of synoptic reporting. What we did with the Swiss academic pathology departments a while ago in Switzerland is to at least have a common list for translations of the more common terms. So here you see a part of this list, and many of these are fairly straightforward, but nevertheless it's important for homogeneity among institutions and also among the different protocols to agree on a single list, because for many terms it's not absolutely evident that it should be this one or another translation. And obviously homogeneity and consistency is of a great interest in this context. It's not quite so straightforward for some of the terms. So, for example, some things just don't work outside English. We neither in English, neither in German nor in French, we've been able to find a good literal translation for tumor focality. So we just went for a number of tumor foci uninvolved. It was a bit similar. Then in other instances, we actually use the English terminology alongside the respective German or French translation. So we would give both brisk and the respective German and or French translation, and then similarly for non-brisk for the lymphocytic infiltrate in melanoma. Sometimes the terminology is just a bit differently used. So in terms of extranodal, it's rather extracapsular in English and in German and in French. And some things that are not an issue in English may be an issue in another language. For example, a common translation for well differentiated could be mistaken for high grade. So this is something we were also made a specific suggestion to use rather another nomenclature to avoid this risk. We implemented this when I was working at the University of Bern, so in German-speaking part of Switzerland. What we did there is we wanted to have this with as little software implementation as possible. So we did not go deliberately not go for a database structure, but we did this for a start purely text-based with the auto-text functionality that was available in our pathology information system. In order to speed up this and to gain experience that then would later inform our the database solution we were hoping for. We made a lot of effort to find a simple format that would be feasible with our with the functionality our laboratory information system offered, and also to avoid overly long reports, because this is an issue if you just list everything, all the conditional, optional items, that this can be reports get very long, and this may not be very appealing to read. So we did a lot of effort there. We did this for German and for French because this is in the border region between the two languages, and the department has mostly German but a small percentage of French cases. And we found that this was quite easy to implement like this. And after 2 years, when we did the statistic, we were able to implement 20 different protocols, and by the time had reported about 2,000 cancer cases in this synoptic format. So this worked fairly well. Actually, pathologists were fairly happy with it and rapidly adopted, and also our referring physicians were mostly very happy because this really facilitated data retrieval for them. Just an example of what we did. So what we could do with the laboratory information system was to present text in either italics or bold or underlined. So this is what we used. We were not able to use tables, so we found a format where this was not necessary, and we had the possibility to use hash tag signs in order to prevent accidental sign up of the report. And just as this is sometimes done in coding, we use these hash signs in order to mark optional data elements. So this would show you that if this was not applicable, so if this specific test had not been done, you would just eliminate the line. Otherwise, you would eliminate the hash signs and choose the appropriate result. So either mutation present, and you would specify the mutation, or you would specify that no mutation has been identified. And like this, from this auto text, you would easily get such a result, which is easy to retrieve and contains all the necessary information, so you don't forget anything. And here another example. This is also in German, but actual content doesn't matter too much. So we would have a heading which would refer to the protocol. This is an optional line. So here it says, if applicable, otherwise delete the line. Same for this one. These are mandatory, so you would fill in these by hand. Again, an optional line, and we would mark the end of the synoptic part of the report, and always reference the version of the protocol in order to better document and then to facilitate further later follow-up when in the past one wouldn't be entirely sure what protocol at a given time point might have been used, because obviously there are some changes from version to version. What we found in terms of completeness is that this very simple format worked very well. So you see here the completeness with the previous traditional narrative report, so just text, and here synoptic, and you see that it gets better, so more towards green for almost everything. I would like to mention that those parameters that were already very good before, so green or a bright yellow, were those that were included in the previous dictation template. So even if the previous format was narrative, it was a dictation template. Obviously, this worked not as well as the our simple synoptic reporting, but for the parameters that were included in the dictation template, completeness was already quite good before, but for most we really saw a big improvement. So also this simple thing worked quite well. So what can I conclude from this? Even if this was low tech, it worked for us, and it may be worthwhile to try for others. I think a very important point was that this allowed us to separate all the issues in terms of mindset, because there may be quite some hesitancy among pathologists, also some difficulties in certain cases in communication with clinicians. So you can, like this, you can focus on the mindset, cultural aspects, and defer the more challenging technical issues to later. It works. It worked quickly. So allowed us to learn also quickly, learn from some minor mistakes in the beginning, improve the later protocols, and this is very flexible, so you can tailor such an approach to the features and also the limitations your local pathology information system has. We found, as I mentioned, that completeness was as good as what was reported in the literature for database solutions. Notably, it was still a very marked improvement compared to just a dictation template we used before. We found this very useful for tumor boards, but also for our clinical research, because it gets much, even if there's no database, it gets already much easier to extract interesting information. However, this is not a viable long-term solution. This also became clear. The burden of implementing this and keeping it updated for all these different protocols in a single institution is quite massive. And this only works if the subspecialists are on board, and if it's not the case for a certain subspecialty, it gets very difficult. So good for the beginning, certainly not ideal for a long-term solution. An idea that is now being worked on in Switzerland is in the context of the PathLink project that I mentioned already, a common database solution which then connects to each local laboratory information system, which allows for some flexibility also in terms of languages, in terms of local modifications, but this is still going on. And obviously in a context like today, it's important to mention that just a synoptic format is by no means the greatest extent of structuring you can do and you should do to your reports. It works well for immediate clinical needs. It's not that bad for us as pathologists, but the really full advantage of this comes only with higher levels of integration, and notably unified terminology such as obviously SNOMED. My personal conclusions are such a local implementation was nevertheless a good thing to have done. It's feasible. It was a very interesting interaction with many clinical colleagues, because this was obviously an opportunity to discuss their demands, what they need. Buy-in of pathologists and of the head of the department is absolutely crucial. The protocols that are published by CAP and ICR are very useful sources of information for pathologists and probably also for clinicians, even if one is not yet working with synoptic reporting. And stepwise, low-tech worked well for us and was very helpful to learn for possible more sophisticated solutions. And from this arises, however, the need for institutional solutions on a national or international level that address the language issues, that address the IT issues. The question that is open for me is whether this would be rather commercial providers or non-for-profit providers, as it's the case with, as I understand, in the Netherlands with the software solution that Palcha offers. Anyway, there's a lot of work to be done, and I thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Eckhart. So we have a couple of very specific questions. One, so is CE marking mandated in Switzerland, or is it something you use more locally driven?
Excuse me, the first part, what is required?
CE marking?
I guess we have the same situation as in the European Union. So for everything that is laboratory developed test, I guess the same regulations would apply as in the European Union. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure how this would apply to the way we report.
Okay.
But maybe the person would like to specify this.
I'm sure they will. So Paul, I know you can hear me, so just expand on your question. The second one is a bit more pertinent in some ways to some of the discussions we've been having around cancer synoptic reporting in general. So are things like the TNM codes, FIGO, so the staging, are they automatically generated, or is it a more manual process which can then be reported electronically? Does that make sense?
Well, with our absolutely low-tech approach, this was not automatically generated. Actually, with the PathoLink database, this works automatically. But yeah, this is obviously one, I would guess, relatively low-hanging fruit compared to others which are with a lot of impact. So this is definitely something to go for. So we went really for the lowest imaginable tech approach, which did not include this in the beginning. But theoretically, you should be able to infer this from all the other parameters.
Okay. So I have a raised hand. So my colleague, Charles, what is your question? Fire away.
Thanks very much, Ian. And Eckhard, really nice presentation. So thank you very, very much for that. My question is whether in your lab or whether in labs in Switzerland, you've started to change over to using digital imaging, and whether that connects to any of the software that you've been describing.
So in most institutions in Switzerland, this is an ongoing process. There's, to my knowledge, no one who's 100 or 90% digital, and probably, at least among the larger institutions, no one left who is 0% digital. Well, if you look for a connection, I think biomarkers would be an obvious target. Maybe you can imagine in a sophisticated situation where the measurement of the tumor on the histological slide goes into the report. This would obviously be nice. I guess we are still in such an early phase that this is probably not our main concern. But even if we do an image analysis for a nuclear marker, I guess it would be more easy to put it by hand into the database. But even though this is a bit obviously not very sophisticated, but for practical terms, I guess the potential is limited for the time being. I think a very practical aspect is that all this integrates very well with a situation where you really work 100% at your computer and to have less constraints in terms of the part of the this planet where you have to be while you do your work.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, so we're running short on time, so we need to move to the next presenter. So Eckhard, I'd like to thank you very much. There are a couple of comments in the Q&A and chat to you personally that I'll leave you to answer. But I'd like to move on the agenda now a little. So still keeping in the cancer synoptic domain, but I'd like to hand over the screen with trepidation to my colleague and friend, although how long that will remain so is debatable. So Scott Campbell. So Scott, over to you.
Wow. Well, I was going to say it's so nice to see so many people but one person in particular, I was going to say it was just disappointing to hear Paul so often today, but you actually just trumped Paul, Ian. I'm kidding. Of course. It's wonderful to actually see everybody, and thanks, Ian. You know, I was looking at the as I prep this real quick, I was looking at the attendee list, and it really, it's with a tinge of sadness that I don't get to see some of these people that I've missed for so long. So several of you know who you are, and so so it's bittersweet, if you would, right? All right, Ian, can we see the screen?
Yes, you can.
Okay, excellent. Well, I don't think I could have paid you enough, Ian. Well, maybe you owe me money, except to have Eckhart present first, because Eckhart, that was wonderful. And thank you very, very much for a really nice presentation on structured cancer reporting and synoptic reporting. Perhaps I owe you a beer for doing such a nice job. So what I would like to share here today is the work that was begun a long time ago to begin to develop the SNOMED CT content specifically to support structured cancer reporting in the form of synoptic reporting. So let's dive in, and this is really an update on as well with regards to an ongoing working group. Now, I do have to say, I get to do this presentation, but my other colleague who shares my last name in only a small segment of our genome, that would be Dr. Jim Campbell, is a collaborator on this, and he's recognized later, but I do want to verbally recognize him, both because he was my mentor, he's beat me several times, and I do believe that he's about to be arrested in the United States for harming graduate students like me. So that was a joke as well. Okay, the work that we have done has received some funding from the National Institute of Health and our PCORI effort in the United States. So we want to recognize some funding that we've gotten. So I won't have to review this too much, but Eckhart, as you said, the histopathology cancer report is really the histopathologist's assessment of excised tissue specimens, whether it's a resection or a biopsy. It is a collection of macroscopic and microscopic observations that are necessary to diagnose cancer and provide prognostic information to the clinician and the surgeon. It really is still the gold standard in cancer diagnosis. It is the definitive diagnosis, really. And those data elements that the pathologist records are critical for use in multiple different ways. One specific one being the registry uses and efforts in the various nations to surveil public health, and I believe our next presenter will talk about that use of the registries and cancer data. So this is fundamental. The problem is this, as Eckhart showed, is really been the status of most pathology reports, and thank you to Carlos Fernandez Moro from the Karolinska Institute. But this is what we are very used to seeing from pathologists and pathology reporting systems. Note everything in red are the sentences or words in red are the only clinically important components of this data. The rest I like to tongue in cheek or a little bit of teasing to my pathology colleagues is poetry. The rest of it is just poetry. And the real data is in the red. I failed to introduce myself, Ian, so silly me. I'm Scott Campbell. For those of you who don't know me, many of you already do. So as Ian said, fear and trepidation. I am a bioinformatics professor or associate professor at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, right in the middle of the United States. If you would, Ebola Central, first cases of COVID, biocontainment unit, nuclear command for the United States. So we're either dead biologically or we're dead nuclearly. So it was really nice to know all of you. that being said, I'm also a SNOMED author as well as an implementation advisor and chair the Cancer Synoptic Reporting Group. So pardon me for a late introduction, but there you go. So this pathology report that we see, it's really hard to find these data elements in the electronic health record after the initial reading, right? This is a paper report. I always like to say all pathology knowledge is lost to the PDF document. The data is really only accessible after initial reading, either by some form of natural language, and this data is not easily extracted or reused, right? It's very nice for the first read, assuming it's all complete. As Eckhart said, sometimes there are elements that are not complete, thus structured reporting. We are seeing a move towards structured reporting. This is another version of structured reporting. Eckhart basically shared this when a pathology or a check sheet or a synoptic report, a protocol is followed. This would be one way that the report is rendered in a digital format. Again, the only information that, or the key information that's clinically germane and relevant is in red. So again, lots of extra words, if you would. But of course it's visually structured, but computability is still missing. What's interesting is that we all are starting to, in general, in pathology, and Eckhart again demonstrated it from the Swiss experience. It's all the same, but a little different. We have the US CAP generating these structured protocols. The Australasians, the RCPA in particular, also developing structured reports. The UK and RCPath generating it. The ICCR generating it, and Polka generating. Those are just 5 examples of international bodies or professional colleges or groups that are moving pathology reporting from a narrative to a computable, structured, and then ultimately computable mechanism. And it's fun, actually, Eckhart, that you cited the same diagram. And I just want to say that in our illustrious audience here, Andrea McLean, she's in the audience. Hi, Andrea, from our friends in Canada. So she was one of the authors on this, along with Dr. Shrigley. So thank you, Andrea, for always your support, by the way. So what we've been trying to do in the world of pathology is go from this natural language to a more discrete type of reporting, both in terms of how to find the data, as well as, if you would, and Eckhart, you brought this up, to ensure that the minimum data set or the minimum pieces of information that are necessary to diagnose the cancer and provide the clinician and the surgeon with the data that they need to begin therapy is provided. And one of your last slides was very helpful with that, showing how the synoptic report helped more complete data being provided. Now, the issue still remains. There's still data that's lost to follow up, and really in our cancer reports. Even if we are using structured reporting in the form of a synoptic report, we're losing that data after the initial report if it's done on paper, right? Even when there are structured data, it can be lost when it's not encoded in a common terminology. So by structured, I mean maybe you have controlled answer sets for any particular question that's posed to the pathologist, and that data becomes very difficult to find, and in particular to share across either enterprises, universities, research institutes, care locations, or whatnot. So a common terminology is really not enough unless the terminology can support analytics. And this really is the problem that we aim to solve with SNOMED CT when we began this project. So and John Shrigley actually brought this up when we were talking about this. He said with the efforts that we're doing in the SNOMED CT group, the Cancer Synoptic Reporting Working Group, actually at a level to his original diagram, and that's a semantic logical interoperation between collaborators and sharing a common logical terminology. So it's not just a specific number assigned to a specific data element, but those codes actually convey meaning and context about the observation and what was being attempted to be observed. And it gives us something that's much richer in terms of our data and our data understanding. And as you referred, Eckhart, to the ontologies, the development of these ontologies. And we'll get into that here shortly. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Cancer Synoptic Working Group, this was a group that started, well, specifically is charged to develop the SNOMED CT pre-coordinated expressions to encode the structured synoptic cancer reporting protocols, right? How are we doing that? Well, it's a collaborative authoring exercise. There are a number of people who have been very dedicated to showing up every other week and discussing things as esoteric as a tumor deposit. And most recently in our last meeting last week, anatomic integrity. Only in SNOMED can people quibble about words as much as we quibble about words, except maybe politicians. So that being said, we have done this collaborative authoring. We are using the observable entity concept model. That was a decision that Jim Campbell and I made well before this became a SNOMED project. We did that because we are also researchers, and we wanted to test the model that was being developed by SNOMED. We've started with adult solid tumors. Our method also included a semantic review of content that's contained in the synoptic worksheets or the synoptic protocols, both broadly and very in depth on particular concepts. We have used templates to model content for like concepts. By like concept, histologic type of primary malignant neoplasm of organ X. We can mass author with it and be very, our quality can be either consistently good or consistently bad, but at least it's consistent when we use a template to author. And we are progressing from solid tumors to immunohistochemistry and genomics. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. When I talk about semantic groupings, the intent is to look at this not in great detail, but step back a little bit. Each of the rows represents a particular type of question or observation that is being asked of the pathologist to make. The columns represent the various College of American Pathologists protocols. We started with the CAP, one, because I live in the US. Two, their content is very easily accessible. Three, the CAP are what I call pathology splitters versus lumpers. The pathologists in the group will know what I mean. If you would, the Brits, the English are more of lumpers. They will have a gastrointestinal protocol, which has subchapters for each particular organ. The College of American Pathologists calls out each particular organ and, frankly, each particular bend in each particular organ. That is particularly pointed to Sam Spencer, who's head of that group at the CAP, who's on the call and poking fun at her. But we reviewed this concept, and where you can see there are white lines with check boxes on any particular row, that tells us from our analysis that those concepts are semantically equivalent. So one template will likely address all of those concepts when we get there. So, and you'll notice that, for example, bone marrow, if you're looking the orange column, we are not doing, right now we are holding off on lymph cancers and blood cancers, basically non-solid tumor cancers and pediatric cancers, because of the genomic component that's necessary to represent in those. So we started with the solid tumors first, because there's much more, there's less genomics in the synoptic protocols, at least initially. So a brief project history. We started this project back in 2014, and it began with I invited myself, and Ian will probably laugh because he remembers, I invited myself to a business meeting, a SNOMED only business meeting in the Chelsea district, if I'm not mistaken, in the UK, and said, you know, we really need to work with the IPALM and start something that's important around synoptic reporting. Is a major need as represented at the US and the UK and elsewhere. And we have to start this project. And Dr. Jim Campbell and I had recently been funded to do some work in this area. So we had a kickoff meeting there we had the National Library of Medicine was there, CAP was represented, RC Path was represented, NHS Digital was represented. I don't remember the name at that point in time. It was some other acronym. And we had a discussion of what we tried to do. We decided that all the initial authoring and experimentation would be done in quarantine, a word that we're all too familiar with these days, and do all authoring in the Nebraska namespace using the University of Nebraska's authoring platform and whatnot, very tightly bound to the Observables project group. And eventually this moved into a formal SNOMED International Working Group in 2019. And in 2020, Jim Campbell and I and the university donated our content developed to date to SNOMED International. Now, what is going on? So after the donation of the content, we began to author using the SNOMED International authoring platform. So we have become, I think we were one of the first guinea pigs to be in the community authoring space. We like to be guinea pigs in Nebraska. It's the only way we get attention. But what we did is we've been authoring on a regular basis. Every other week, we have a large group meeting, which is attended by authors, informaticists, physicians, and we discuss various concepts that need to be modeled, making sure that we get a lot of input from our pathology experts, and we become informed on various levels that a terminologist like myself or others wouldn't necessarily understand without the expressed intended meaning as offered by the pathologists for the data they're trying to collect. At the end of July, 300 new and or fully modeled concepts were released into the international edition. There are approximately 350 more being released here at the end of this month. And collectively, that represents over 80% of the data elements that are represented in solid tumor protocols for adults, for adult tumors. That's pretty exciting, actually. And we're now, well, we'll talk about the future. So what do I mean by what have we done? Well, previously this concept, histologic type, was exactly that and meant absolutely nothing. There was no definitional content, nothing to be it was a primitive concept. The only way to understand it was look at its supertypes and potentially its subtypes if there were any. There weren't any. What it looks like now is that's a full model, and that's actually from the browser. It's in the international release. It is a measurement of a histologic type. That's a property that adheres in a proliferative mass. So you'll notice we've changed the name, and because that concept ID is so well used, but it was so ill-defined or nebulous that it really meant nothing when we paired the answer, for example, adenocarcinoma with it. So histologic type is adenocarcinoma. That doesn't tell people very much unless you know it's an adenocarcinoma of what organ, right? Different breakpoints determining an adenocarcinoma versus a mixed type or a mucinous type of carcinoma, depending on your organ system, for example, and the pathologists will understand that. You can also see the children that are subsumed by this concept. So this is actually in production and available for international use now. Let's talk a little bit about what did we do. So here is a very explicit example of a histologic type, and it's the histologic type of the primary malignant neoplasm of colon. So that is the fully specified name, and it is very descriptive of how this is defined. I would not ever put that in a user interface in an electronic format, but thank goodness we don't have to. But it is defined as a subtype. Well, this is the inferred view. It is a subtype of a histologic type of a primary malignant neoplasm. We're measuring the property is a histologic type property. That property exists or adheres in the primary malignant neoplasm that is located in the colon structure. Okay, so, and then we have a couple other defining factors. This is a point in time measurement, right? It's not like Eckhart, you have growing colon on your underneath your microscope that you can watch evolve, right? So it's point in time, and it's a nominal value because we expect the pathologist to tell us the specific histology that they observe, right? Adenocarcinoma, mucinous adenocarcinoma, signet ring cell cancer, right? So, but this is the level of detail that we have gone to for as much content as we can for many reasons. And let me just show you some other examples just so you get a feel. We've also modeled histologic grades. So in this case, this is the presence of direct invasion of the primary malignant neoplasm of larynx to nerve. In other words, this is perineural invasion observed in the larynx. One thing that we did in this exercise is we've begun to define tumor progression or describe the process of invasion. So is this direct local invasion? Is this metastatic proliferation? So we've begun to look at tumors and characterize those aspects of the tumors that are important to understand both from a clinical perspective as well as a registry and research perspective. So understanding that something is originating in a primary site tumor of the larynx, for example, and is directly extending into the perineural space or in the neural space. That's important to understand that this is not discontinuous spread, but this is perceived continuous spread. The answers that would go with this histologic grade. Oh, I messed that up. Histologic grade and perineural. Shame on me. Okay, I picked the wrong sample. That's what you get when you're working and you're tired. The answer here, and I am so terribly sorry, folks. I just gave you tumor extension. We would also have grade. The property would be histologic grade, but here would be the responses. Those are correct. We have changed responses. Ian, I know what's the difference between a grade and invasion? Oh, probably an F. But anyway, so we have changed how we're modeling grades. They have typically been modeled previously by the CAP as findings. We've changed them to qualifier values because a qualifier value marries up quite nicely and is easier to make sense of when it's paired with the histologic grade or the question itself. Oh dear, now I have to talk about local invasion. Oh, look at, I swear, Ian, something happened last night in the structure of, oh, good night. So funny story, folks. I thought we only had 10 minutes per presenter. And then I went back. That's how busy life has been in the US with COVID in my lab. And then I go, oh my goodness, I don't have 10 minutes. I have 30 minutes. Oops. So I had to add some content for that would elaborate. So, oh, good night. So modeling of invasion, I'll go back to this. When we model invasion, we model it in two ways. One is the presence of invasion, that there is direct invasion to the nerve structure. This is the appropriate one, presence of invasion. This has an answer present, absent, or cannot be determined. So what we are doing when we model invasion is represented in the synoptic reports in two ways. One, it's the presence of. So this is often found, for example, in organs that are not layered. For the prostate would be a great example. The prostate, the tumor is directly extended to the periprostatic tissue. That would also be considered, EPE, if you would, extended prosthetic, external prosthetic extension. So what we do here is we're saying that we're characterizing, we're measuring a property of presence, but it's characterizing a local direct invasion, and that invasion is extending to a specific physical or anatomic location. In this case, it's the nerve structure. Okay, so this is a declarative statement, and several of the protocols represent invasion in that fashion. The other way that invasion is represented is the primary tumor extends to fill in the blank, some anatomic location that is constrained by a list of options. For example, in the colon, the direct extension, the anatomic location of the direct extension of the primary malignant neoplasm of the colon, blank, potential answers: colonic lamina propria, colonic submucosa, colonic muscularis propria, right? Visceral peritoneum. That's important. So two ways that these types of data are communicated. Besides copying and pasting the wrong pictures, you can find them yourselves in the in the browser. We went to extensive levels in modeling these concepts very, very explicitly. Other content that is also to be released by the end of October, or is already released, are dimensions of the neoplasm, grading systems, including Gleason, Nottingham, ISUP, and then generic WHO, lymph node observables, lymphovascular invasion, perineural invasion, surgical margins, and presence of neoplasm at surgical margin X. And these have been modeled all the way to the level of the particular surgery, the approach, and the margins that are created in that approach. So the distal surgical margin in a colon, we know that that is distal to the center of the human. So there's definitions and more definitions of margins based on anatomic locations, not naming the anatomic location, but anatomic orientation. That is now in the morphologic abnormality hierarchy because it's an acquired body structure. It's actually a subtype of an acquired body structure. None of us were born with surgical margins that I'm aware of. But that's content that is coming. Well, how do we implement this? So this is something, this is actually from the University of Nebraska Medical Center's Cerner CoPath system. This is what the synoptic report looks like for the pathologist who's documenting the case. They are not physically circling, though those numbers are actually clicking on those numbers. Cerner draws a little box or circle around them, but that is all the pathologist sees. They never see the SNOMED CT concept, period. What does happen is behind the scenes, we send an HL7 version 2 message out from our system upon sign out. And what you see there is a standard HL7 version 2 message where OBX3 is the SNOMED encoded observable entity, and OBX5, which is in green, is the answer. Collectively, we have a question answer pair. We send this, right now, we send this directly to our tumor biobank, along with all the other encoded data for this cancer case. We are actually working to make this work with our EPIC system. We have a disparate system between EPIC and Cerner. If you were using EPIC by itself, this information would be embedded in the cancer protocol and stored in EPIC's data model. However, this is what the report looks like for the human. So we've created a readable report for the human and a machine readable report for the machine and for secondary data use. Okay. So the question is, why do we want to use SNOMED CT? Well, one, the use of stated and inferred logical relationships and groupings. So we can define, and Eckhart does it, and to the pathologists that we work with, it is incredibly important that we understand precisely what you as the pathologist are trying to measure or assess, and we create that definition, and then we can apply the SNOMED CT axioms upon those expressions, and we start to get relationships in inferred. We establish those logically true relationships and groupings that must be present if our logic is correct and that observation is correct. And I'll show you an example in a minute. The other reason is synonymy, so common terms, right? As Eckhart, you said, tumor focality versus number of foci. Real common problem, right? And even in English, we seem to butcher our own language, let alone try to translate it into someone else's language, to a non-English language. So by modeling this in the FSN and making this FSN very, very clear, right? We distill, or if you would, try to reduce the colloquialness of our language, right? Focality versus number of tumor foci. That we try to get to the core meaning. We also know that these things can be, like I said, translated using that logical definition to something that is more appropriate in another language. We also know that many of the international agreed upon standards are supported and or being developed by member nations. That's North America, CAP, and the US and Canada. That represents CAP. Europe, we've obviously said those folks already. Sweden is working very, very hard and working closely with Palika on their work, and Australasia with Australia and New Zealand. And ultimately, when we use SNOMED CT, we're creating a data interoperability between national registries. This is important. You know, we're looking at, now we can start to look at global population health, right? And how cancer manifests itself in the US versus Northern Europe versus Asia versus South America. There are differences, and we know that. It'd be nice to be able to compare our data and understand the differences and why. So one reason, and I just want to show this example just because I think people sometimes ask, well, why can't you just give a number to something or a name and just everybody agree on the same term? Well, perhaps that's true, but we lose the natural logical aggregation components that SNOMED offers. So for example, this is just a series of observable entities and histologic types of various neoplasms. When we run our classifier, look what we get. We get an observable entity that is a parent of a histologic type of some malignant neoplasm, but then it can be subtyped and channeled to histologic type of a primary malignant neoplasm versus a metastatic. And notice we group the female genital tract we have the fallopian tube, vulva, vagina, ovary, uterus, are all grouped under the female genital tract. And then further, the cervix is a subtype of the uterus or is a component of the uterus. Those are disjoint from the histologic type of the colon. So if we were trying to do a study or we were reviewing different histologies in the female genital tract versus or uniquely, we can aggregate observations specific with the SNOMED CT encoded value and the response. And this allows us then to do different types of research, you know, and help us both aggregate or get very, very granular in our research. What are the next phases for this project? Well, one, we're going to fill in the gaps for adult solid tumor observables. So we covered a vast amount of territory, but there are unique observations that are specific to any particular or a unique organ. For example, tumor deposits is pretty unique to the colon and the appendix, but it's not something that we would see in other organs. So tumor buds is also a concept that's floating around. So we are now doing a gap analysis for all solid tumors to identify those onesie twosies that we haven't yet modeled. And we are beginning immunohistochemistry modeling. So this is necessary for solid tumors, but is very, very important for our non-solid tumors. Genomics and cytogenomics modeling is a very close second. The citation you see there is the model we are going to begin with for genomics. We'll go from there. For folks who are interested in learning more about the project and the documentation we've created to support these concepts, that link is to Confluence, and all our documentation specific to content that's been developed is there, and the reasoning, the thought process, and where we were going. Now, in terms of immunohistochemistry, this is a predicate, an early example of what we're basically, or how we're going to approach this. This is an MLH1 gene expression, so something that we would see in colon tumors for mismatch repair. And basically what we're saying is we're going to measure a property that is a sequence. Basically, we're measuring a sequence in this particular thing, but we're not doing it directly on the sequence. We're actually measuring it on a substance. So we're going to infer some sequence about the MLH1 gene locus by how the produced protein manifests itself, right? So it's an indirect measurement of an abnormality in the sequence. So in this case, the potential value set would be intact, not intact, would be the responses, at least in US English, how we would phrase that, right? The protein is behaving normally, or the protein is not behaving normally, per this stain. Likewise, for next-gen sequencing, we are basically saying we are here, this is a KRAS sequence variant identified in excised malignant neoplasm. This is still under construction, but it's described in the manuscript that I cited. But basically, again, we're saying we're measuring a sequence variant property, or a sequence, if you would, that adheres in the KRAS gene locus that is in a malignant piece of tissue. In this case, we don't know if it's primary, secondary, or whatnot. So in this case, we're looking, it's part of the differentiation between somatic. Is this a somatic mutation, or is this something I was born with, right? Or did this develop in the cancer? And the answer actually will be an HGVS gene expression. Okay, so we'll use our intention is that the response should really be what the Human Genome Variant Society, or Varnoman's sequence representation is. That is a widely agreed upon standard, calls out the gene, the reference genome, the type of mutation, the protein that is made or would likely be made. You may ask why the heck we're doing all this besides a fun project. Ultimately, we are trying to answer these types of questions and let our data, all the work of the physicians and the clinicians and people involved in this, to aggregate knowledge so that we can start to look at cancer treatment planning. What for all the colorectal cancers of stage 4 metastatic that tested positive for BRAF, RAS genes, MSI, and others, was appropriate immunotherapy applied, or targeted therapy applied? What were the outcomes? How many healthy patients have a BRCA1, BRCA2 positive mutation, and retrieve all breast cancers that were triple negative, right? And you can read the following. So the reason we do this is to support this type of work, whether it's in your clinical information system, whether it's supporting the registry community, to really exploit the data that they collect to identify possible therapies, best treatment plans, et cetera. So very, very important. And last and not least, lots of people to acknowledge. If I have forgotten your name, please forgive me. If I make a mistake on a diagram, then I probably left off a name. So, but lots of people at Snowmed International to express gratitude towards CAP folks, very involved, RC Path folks, very involved, Polka, very involved, the Swedes, very involved. Stefan, I didn't know where to put you because you're wandering over borders, so I wasn't sure if I should put you in Polka or Sweden. You're now Swedish. Nictus, Pim Volker has been very, very helpful. The ICCR has been very involved, very supportive. The US CDC, and of course my colleagues at my university have just been fabulous. Ian, I pass it back to you.
Okay, so thank you for a Well, in fact, for two things, actually. One, for a very comprehensive presentation, and in some ways for teeing up some of the discussion points for the next two presenters, both in terms, well, particularly in terms of the registries and analytics in general, I think, which will come out of some of the discussions around research. So I have a general question for you, which you'll love, Scott. So one of the problems which both Eckhart and yourself have identified is the fact that within the pathology space, there are lots of standards. So the one thing we love about standards is the fact there are so many to choose from. So if you ruled the world, how would you go about improving the uptake of cancer synoptic reporting and standardizing it to maximize its use?
Oh, yeah. Well, perhaps there's, I don't know. Could we solve world hunger first?
Easier, but
yeah. So I can speak. So from the U.S. perspective, and what I'm watching happen in the Netherlands with the leadership of Palka, is there is a requirement, right, that synoptic reports are used. So if you are in the U.S., this is, in one sense, it's quite easy to, because in order to be a certified laboratory, one must be following some form of synoptic reporting and structured cancer reporting. Now, does it mean that you have to use the CAP's paper forms or electronic forms? No, that as long as it's in a structured format. However, even as I alluded to, even using the structured report, we lose data, right? If it's not encoded. So what we are attempting to do in the US is, now that we've created a certain penetration, if you would, or critical mass of encoded content, is we are now mapping those into the CAP ECCs, and Dr. Spencer is on the phone, and she can put a comment out there if she'd like. But what will then happen is that SNOMED CT content will be distributed along with the electronic versions of the synoptic reports structure as published by the CAP. So, and that is used by about 50% of the pathologists in the United States in electronic form. So that's a pretty critical mass. The other thing that we are doing, Ian, just so you know, and Stefan Dubois from Stefan has to declare what nation he's from. I don't know anymore. But Stefan, who is now practicing pathology in Sweden, but he is Dutch, so he's very confused. What we are doing now collectively is we're assessing we're now beginning to look at all synoptic reports as published, protocols as published by the CAP, RCPath, RCPA, ICCR, and Palka, and making and identifying the semantic alignment between those, and then put the SNOMED CT concept with that. So that helps us to begin to align and facilitate distribution of the content in those various societies. But is that the answer to you? Is that answering the question you asked?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I think it's, I mean, one of the challenges is always the fact that change is always, I'll borrow one of Charles' terms, so change is always quite glacial in a lot of areas of clinical specialties. And it seems especially that's the case in pathology. I think one of the challenges is just driving things forward at a reasonable rate of knots, where you don't, you get good uptake, but you don't lose the population in the process in some ways.
Yeah.
So there are challenges, but yes.
Well, I will say a couple of things. SNOMED's a bit openness to address this problem, right? And basically, for all intents and purposes, sponsor this work, right? Has been immensely helpful, because many of the nations that that our member nations are also publishing these protocols, or creating and maintaining these protocols. So, you know, it was in great service to the member nations. So without the encoding, you know, and without SNOMED CT's internationals, you know, support, this effort wouldn't even have gotten off the ground. So, and the fact that we've covered almost 80% of solid tumor content is quite remarkable. You know, just it's been an enormous effort from a lot of folks. Hey, and I see George Brock's asked a question, and George, can I respond to that one real quick, Ian?
Yep.
So Dr. Brock's mentioned that carcinoma is a passé term. It really actually only belongs to epithelial tumors. Why not drop cancer and use malignant neoplasm instead? And actually, Dr. Brock's, that's in fact what we did, at least in the observables component. You'll notice that tumor type and the word tumor is now a neoplasm. And in fact, we go all the way up to a higher level, and we call these growths proliferative masses, because in the world of SNOMED, a polyp is a proliferative mass, but it's not yet considered a neoplasm. So we have tried to eliminate some of these overburdened words, but in terms of calling cancer cancer, I mean, we call it, you know, that would be like changing the world's vocabulary. So we can't go that far, but we can certainly do some control within SNOMED to make sure that the concepts represent something that is definitive and not heavily laden with if you would, extra meaning or nuanced meaning. So there you go. I hope that's a sufficient answer.
It is. So so thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
I'm going to call the first half of this meeting to a close. So I suggest we have a break now for 10 minutes. So if we can aim to be back just before 1:15. So literally just over 10 minutes, we'll keep it to a 10-minute break, and then we'll restart with our two further presenters. So we'll see you all in 10 minutes. So welcome back. We seem to have kept most of the participants, which is always good. So I'm trying to keep us vaguely to time. So let's move to our next presenter, who's Laura from the Catalan Registry. But Laura, I'll let you introduce yourself. So Laura, over to you. You're on mute.
Yeah,
Not now. Good.
Hello, I'm Laura. As you said, I work in the Catalan Pathology Registry and the Catalan Cancer Plan. And, well, I'll try to share the screen. Here. Now, can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can see. Yeah, we can see the screen. Great, thank you.
Hello again. Well, I'm gonna talk about how cancer registries can detect neoplasms in pathology laboratories that go with SNOMED CT. Well, first of all, let me introduce what is considered a cancer registry. The International Agency for Research of Cancer defines 3 kinds of registry types: hospital-based cancer registries, pathology-based cancer registries, population-based cancer registries. Hospital-based cancer registries register all cancer cases treated in one or more hospitals, and they are mainly used for administrative purposes and for reviewing clinical performance. Pathology-based cancer registries get information from one or more laboratories on histologically diagnosed cancers, and they support the need for laboratory-based services and serve as a quick snapshot of the cancer profile. These two cancer registries can't be used in formulating cancer plans because they are based in an incomplete and biased sample of the population. On the other hand, population-based cancer registries record all reportable neoplasms occurring in a geographically defined population from multiple data sources. They can be used for the interpretation of population-based cancer incidence data and support population-based actions aimed at reducing the cancer burden in a community. This kind, excuse me, this kind of cancer registries provide an unbiased profile of the cancer burden in a population and how it is changing over time. In our case, we don't consider pathology-based cancer registries as a proper cancer registry itself. We treat it more like an important source for the other kinds of cancer registries. Either hospital-based cancer registries or mortality or population-based cancer registries, they use a lot of different data sources. They give information on, they can get information on treatments, on multidisciplinary decision teams, anything. But the most important sources of information for cancer registries are the hospital discharge records, the pathology records, and the mortality data. Both mortality and discharge records are usually well structured and codified using the International Classification of Diseases in any additional version. While the pathology reports, at least in our case, are usually codified using SNOMED CT and SNOMED. So in 2002, if I'm not wrong, appears SNOMED CT as an evolution of SNOMED. And we start working with this because it appears at the same time that when the Catalan government starts building what is a centralized electronic health record database. So it's the perfect moment for introducing SNOMED CT in the pathology laboratories, because all the software was changing and adapting to cover all this. So we start from the laboratories in hospitals or in primary care services, and all these records are sent to the decentralized electronic health records database that follows their standards, their quality standards. So we ensure that these records are recorded in the right manner, and our registry takes the information from here. For those who don't know, this little red spot here is Catalonia. This is in the northeast of Spain and in the south of Europe. We cover 7.5 million inhabitants with a 90% coverage of the public health system. And in this registry, we take information from any medical specialty and from primary care services, general hospitals, and also high technology hospitals. Okay. We had to add this SNOMED CT in our system, in our informatic system. And Snomed CT, as you know, is a huge database. We have about, at this moment, we had about 300,000 concepts, which is more than 1,000 different descriptions. So we started working with the pathology, the CAP pathology subset. There was a manual revision by cancer registries experts, and some concepts were eliminated, mainly because we wanted a provisional subset that only covered human pathology specialties. At the same time, this provisional subset was sent to a team of pathologists that checked and gave us a proposal of a smaller database that they thought that were more likely to be used. At the same time, as we had a lot of contact with those pathologists and we were working in cancer registration, we realized that there were some concepts, mainly from the WHO Blue Books and the WHO Blue Books, or some very special codes or procedures that were not yet, because they were mainly very new, they were not yet included in SNOMED. So we defined what we called a catalog extension that was also included in these two theoretical subsets, one subset, pathological subset, and the microglossary. At the beginning, we checked all these, we made some check-ins, and finally we had a pathological subset of about 19,000 concepts, and the microglossary of 2,500 concepts. Now, at this moment, we are using more than 20,000 for the subset and more than 3,000 for the microglossary. Why this way of working? Well, remember we were defining all these centralized database with an informatic system backing it. So it was to increase efficiency in the search. When a pathology needs to codify any sample, they start looking in the microglossary. Then they search. If they don't find what they're looking for here, they search in the pathology subset. And if they still don't find what they are looking for, they look in the whole Snomed CT database. Once we had all these defined, we started working on how we could detect all cancer in this pathology registry in an easy way. Cancer registries, following European standards, at least in Europe, they mainly codify using the International Classifications of Disease for Oncology that has two parts, the topography set and the morphology set. And the pathologists also use, for codifying, this World Health Organization classification of tumors, the Blue Books, for codifying especially all those new entities that are not still inside this ICD. the morphology codes used in the ICDO and the Hubble books look like this, range from this to this, and it's what in SNOMED was formerly called SNOMED ID. SNOMED CT terminology, as you may know, is structured in 19 hierarchies or axes, and traditionally all these codes used by the cancer registries were included in this body structure axis. Well, but there were changes in SNOMED. Before 2017, we had the concept ID, which had no implicit meaning, and the concept ID, which has this implicit meaning and correlates with the ICDO and Hubble books. And this has been maintained until 2017. For example, a code, a concept ID, like this big number, corresponds to this code in ICDO. After 2017, we only have the concept ID. This means that as our pathologies codify based only on the descriptions, they have to codify regardless of the axis or the tumor behavior. And this makes difficult to identify neoplasms and follow international standards. But what are these international standards? Well, as you can see in this table, depending on the topography of the tumor and the morphology of the tumor, and also the behavior, you decide if you enter this, if you consider this a tumor or not. So we need to know these three variables very clearly. So what do we propose? Okay, then we decided to define two new subsets in SNOMED CT terminology. One, the neoplastic subset, to define very clearly the morphology and the behavior, and it covers all axes. And another one for the topography, which is based in the body structure axis. We also needed a mapping from SNOMED CT to ICDO and Hubble books. When we started doing this, we were working with ICDO 3.1. Now we are working in ICDO 3.2, so it keeps updating all the time. And we needed also an easy way to update, so an automatic update for each subset with every release. No, they don't need to be correlative. SNOMED provides 2 releases a year, excuse me, one in the middle of the year and one in the end, and we also get a Spanish translator. And these are, and also they give all these resources that we use for learning. Okay, how do we construct a neoplastic subset? We started in July with the release from July 15 with the snapshot and inactive concepts, because we wanted to ensure that we kept all those old codes that were previously recorded. We used the body structure axis of those codes in this range. Remember that in July 15, we had both identifiers, SNOMED ID and concept ID. Then we made a list of selected terms. This selected terms is, this list is very wide. It includes terms like neoplasia, or wheels, or PTNM, or, well, you see all these heterogeneous terms. We also use the associated morphology relationship to detect all those neoplasias associated to a disease. We then included all this in a neoplastic subset, but that it was not the final subset, because when we had all this performed, we checked, we took every concept, we went to the top level hierarchy, then searched all the descendants to see if we had missed any descendant. If we found any descendant missing, it was not yet included. Cancer Registries as expert checked whether we should include it or not. The topography subset is obviously a lot more simple. We started in the same point, but we just checked this body structure axis and discarded certain terms, mainly veterinary terms and topographies that were not included in ICDO, for example, the fetus. Then we made a mapping from Snomed CT to this the ICDO rules. We used again a resource given by SNOMED, which is the simple map reference set, and those main codes that were not already included. We map them manually. For the updates, we designed algorithms. We based them on January 17 and January 18 snapshot releases. Remember that here we have still both identifiers, and here we only have one. There is no need with these algorithms that we designed. There is no need for the releases to be correlated. We can jump one to any. And we identified all new concepts with the transitive concept table. For the neoplastic subset, all new concepts were reviewed and mapped manually. And for the topography subset, new concepts were mapped either automatically or manually. Then we performed the validation with 6-month data, with data from January and June 2017 from 8 public high technology hospitals. And we had a sample of 7,000 records or 5,000 specimens. And all was manually reviewed by experts in cancer registration. The results of the validation, we checked for classification in neoplasia versus non-neoplasia. More or less it was 50%, and it was right in 98% of cases. Obviously, the other 2% was corrected. And once we had the classification checked, we checked for the mapping. The mapping was initially right in 97% of mapping. Obviously, we corrected the rest. The topography, for the topography subset, obviously there was not a checking for classification. And 95% was automatically mapped with the resources provided by SNOMED. So we only had to map manually 5% of cases, and it was all completely right. So we finally had 2 subsets, a neoplastic subset and a topography subset. The final neoplastic subset, what we are working now, has 17,000 concepts that correspond to 2,000 morphologies and 34 topography subsets that correspond to 330 topographies in ICDO. And with all these, we are working at this moment to evaluate the impact of COVID in in cancer diagnosis. This, what I'm going to show you, has been sent for publication, but it's not yet published. So we said, okay, what we have? We have a real-time centralized pathology registry that covers over 90% of public assistance. We also have some dictionaries to identify neoplasms that follow international standards for cancer registration. So what we can do with this, we can monitorize the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on pathological cancer diagnosis. So now, what are we doing? We defined a pandemic period of 1 year previous to the total lockdown in Spain, that was on 13th March 13. And a pandemic period that comprises 5 waves from March 14 until September 30th. We are having it in real time. And we compare incident cancer cases that comprise in situ plus invasive tumors between both periods. And we also correlated the pathological cancer diagnosis with the hospital intensive care units occupancy by COVID-19. And what we found? We found what you see here in blue is the number of cancer cases diagnosed or recorded in our registry. And in red, you have the ICU occupancy by COVID-19. As you can see, the first wave, the total lockdown, provoked a great decrease in cancer diagnosis. This is because all elective surgeries were cancelled, and also the screening programs were stopped, and almost everything that was treated in hospitals was COVID. This luckily does not repeat in the following waves. This is what I was talking about. If we correlate the weekly occupancy of COVID-19 ICU occupancy by COVID-19 patients and the number of cases in the pathology registry, we see this strong negative correlation that's almost perfect, in the same way that does not repeat in the second, third, fourth, or fifth wave. This decrease, as you can see, is very high in the first wave. It's still present in the second and third wave. We haven't had time to finish to add the fourth and fifth wave by now. But we expect more or less the same, because we are seeing that the cancer diagnoses are not yet recovering for most sites. So we've been working in a multidisciplinary team, with performing a multidisciplinary work. We think this is important because we have different points of view from pathologists, informatics technicians, epidemiologists, documentalists, and data analysts. We have structured data following international standards. We consider this very important in order to be able to compare our results with other registries and in time. We have subsets that are adapted to specific needs. We have two subsets, pathology subsets and a microglossary, that make our computer systems more efficient. And we also have the neoplastic and topographic subsets that help us to standardize cancer identification in pathology registries. Also, we have a centralized and real-time data. We get data every day because it's linked with this centralized health records database. So with this gives us a lot of flexibility. As we have seen, we have been able to monitorize the effect of COVID-19 pandemic in cancer diagnosis, but we can we could also detect internal cancer in skin programs, or we could make some surveillance of how services use or how they distribute across the whole territory. And I think I've been a little bit quick, maybe. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please ask, and do not hesitate to contact us if you need further information.
So thanks, Laura. I found that really helpful. I think one of the things that we tend to focus on a lot is the development of the standards. So things that we do either at Snomed International or is done through the National Release Centres. And from my perspective, I find it really interesting to see how this is used in, I'll call it the real world. So I think what you're doing is very good.
Thank you.
So we don't have any other questions. Do any of my my panelists have any questions they'd like to ask?
Take into account that English is not my native language, so please be kind.
Well, your English is better than my Spanish, so we'll just leave it.
Okay.
So one very simple question is, at the moment, the translation is presumably only into Spanish and not into Catalan.
Oh, no, we have, I didn't mention, we have the Office of Standards from the Catalan government that translates one of the things that they do, they translate it into Catalan too.
All right, okay. So it's in both languages.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So I have a slightly follow-up question to one of the things you said. So in terms of populating a registry, you've obviously throughout the presentation made that point of how that works. In specific cases though, do you follow up on individual patients from the registry, particularly when you want to look at a greater level of detail to do with diagnosis and treatment specifically?
I don't know if I understand the question.
Well, if you think, okay, so what I'm thinking of, so you obviously have a standard data flow which runs from the patient record to the registry. I know it goes through various other stages, but ultimately you're going from the EHR to the registry. Do you ever have cause to go the other way? So take example of content which is in the registry, which you want to find out more detail. So particularly I'm thinking if you have a patient with a diagnosis or a citizen with a diagnosis that is, I'll call it unusual or unusual. Do you ever have cause to follow up that patient from the registry to get a greater level of detail back from the EHR?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Not in the pathology registry.
Okay.
The population-based cancer registries, in Catalonia, we have two. We have one in Girona and one in Tarragona.
Yeah.
They can follow at the patient level. They use the mortality. We have a centralized mortality database in Catalan and in Catalonia and in Spain, and they can follow anywhere.
Okay. And then one final question before I bring the questions to an end in some ways. So picking up on one of the things which Scott talked about, are you looking at incorporating genomics data within your registry or linking to some of the genomic registries within Catalonia or Spain in general?
Well, at a population level, now we are working because our pathologies, I think I didn't mention, our pathologies codify only morphology and topography in their electronic records. But we are now working in a project to extract all this information that you mentioned, also TNMs, biomarkers, all the other data that it's also in the pathology reports, and it's not yet codified. And we're working in a project to extract it using natural processing languages techniques.
Okay, so thank you, Laura. We have, there's one question in the Q&A box, which I'll leave you to answer because that's more pertinent specifically to one of the things you said. So I'd like to thank you again, and I'd like to move on to our final speaker. So Monica, so Laura, if you can stop sharing the screen, and I'll hand it over to.
I don't know if I get here.
Yeah.
Okay. No new share. Hang on. I don't know how to.
Hang on, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what. I'll do it for you. Okay, so Monica, I'm going to hand over to you. So I would say you need no introduction, but maybe you should introduce yourself. So Monica, I'll let the floor. The screen is yours.
That's lovely. Thanks very much, Ian, and thanks very much for 3 fantastic presentations, including Scott's sort of ad hoc cutting and pasting bloopers, so which keeps us all entertained. So yeah, so I'm basically going to sort of cover the sort of the other end of the spectrum. Some of it is actually, I was delighted with sort of, you know, some of the reports that Laura put out, because actually our findings are quite similar in the UK, but there are some significant sort of differences. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Monica Jones. I've worn many hats over the years, but the one I'm wearing at the moment is as Chief Data Officer for the Health Data Research Hub for Cancer and for HDI UK North. That's the north of England. So what is HDI UK? So this was set up in 2018. It's our National Institute for Data Science, essentially. It's a 20 to 30 year sort of investment, recognizing that actually there's a whole load of healthcare data that is out there, but actually the frustration for researchers actually getting access to that and being able to do meaningful sort of analytics has been somewhat painful sort of over the years. And there are sort of 3 strands really to what is being provided. It's in the center, there are a number of hubs, of which DataCan is one of them. There's 7 of them. So I'm the CDO there. I work for the University of Leeds, but it's a national UK-wide organisation. There's then the UK Health Alliance, which is the Research Alliance, which is really sort of a community of practice and also a sort of commitment, really, from our NHS colleagues, from sort of national arm's length bodies, and from registries and from trials, clinical trials, in order to basically sort of participate and provide data for research in the UK and beyond. And then on the right-hand side, what we've done is, in order to be able to sort of improve access for research, we've created what we call our Innovation Gateway. So this is essentially an online dynamic metadata catalog of a whole load of sort of data sources, data sets that are out there, in order to be able to improve access, to improve the infrastructure, improve the quality, and also provide fair value. This is underpinned by patient and public sort of benefit and the trustworthy use of data complying with all of the appropriate confidentiality and data protection acts that GDPR that apply in the UK. So from a DataCam perspective, so-called because it's about data, it's about cancer, but it's very much about, you know, saying that we can do this. This is our sort of vision on a page, really, putting the patient right at the center, but recognizing that cancer is a complex disease, as we've just seen sort of demonstrated by previous colleagues, is hugely complex. And as part of that overall sort of synopsis and picture, you need access to the clinical data, you need structured and potentially sort of plain text, NLP, genetic and molecular data, radiology and pathology. And there's a need to bring that all together and within the clinical, academic and commercial environment. And, you know, I always say you can't have quality without standards. And that's at the core of what we within the, you know, SNOMED international community sort of truly believe in. You know, I've presented to this forum and other SNOMED international sort of events from the perspective of being a CIO working in the front line of the NHS, actually implementing it within an acute trust. And you will have, some of you will have heard me presenting on that before. Also at a regional sort of level from a population health management. And this is very much at the other end of the sort of spectrum, is saying, right, okay, what comes out the other end? And from a quality perspective, making sure that actually we have that captured at the beginning. So we can't avoid talking about the global pandemic. You know, it's occupied all of our lives, and it's still occupying our lives so for the last sort of 18 months. And what we realized was that as the sort of the first wave hit in sort of spring 2020, is that actually what we were seeing was actually this huge drop off in terms of cancer referrals, in terms of sort of activity, in terms of attendances for chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery, elective surgery, and what have you. And we very rapidly sort of within DataCam recognized that we needed to do something. The anecdotal evidence was that people were more afraid of getting COVID than they were of cancer. And really what we wanted to do was very rapidly sort of bring that attention to the government, academia, NHS and the public, the disastrous effect of COVID-19 on cancer services and cancer patients. The disruption was felt across the entire cancer pathway in terms of presentational delay, diagnostic delay, significant sort of impact on treatment, and also those significant disruption of cancer research, in particular around clinical trials, discovery research, translational research. And these are a number of papers that I've been involved with colleagues, and we've had, you know, quite a good rate in terms of a publication. This is also a piece of work that we did with life sciences organization Carl Farrer around sort of breaking down sort of what we would see as in terms of the percentage. But essentially that big drop that you saw in the, you know, the graph that Laura showed just now happened exactly the same in the UK. We were seeing about a 70% drop in terms of urgent cancer referrals, our sort of, you know, red flag 2-week wait. And also we were seeing about a 40% sort of drop in terms of chemotherapy attendances. And it was very obvious that this was going to, you know, have a much longer term effect. And so what we decided to do was actually do some modeling and try and see if we could predict essentially the excess mortality on data. So we took nearly 4 million citizens data through primary and secondary care sort of linked data set, modeled different scenarios to determine the excess deaths due to the pandemic. We also augmented that with real-time data to inform the model. I think one of the things that we've certainly found in the UK and sort of within my domain is that actually some of the national reported data was just too slow. some of the cancer registration data, particularly in the UK, can take, weeks, months, years in terms of being published, which is, historically has been okay as far as sort of epidemiological, sort of longer term sort of incidence sort of reporting. But when you're right in the heart of a global pandemic, and you're essentially needing to report on a daily, weekly, monthly sort of basis, then frankly, you need something that is fit for purpose. And so we reached out to our network in order to get appropriate data on a weekly basis. And the prediction was sort of looking at sort of these models, sort of not the best case scenario, not the worst case scenario, but essentially from a relative risk perspective, that we were predicting in England between 7 and 18,000 excess deaths, which is a massive amount. So this was really a sort of a call to action, but also, as we all know, sort of the strength of using a clinical terminology such as SNOMED CT gives you contextual information. So therefore, from a comorbidities perspective, we wanted to be able to look at additional risk of excess deaths with at least one underlying condition, and in particular, the ones that came to the top of the list were cardiovascular, not unsurprisingly, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, and COPD, and that also sort of we mapped out and we're continuing to look at in terms of not just COVID, cancer, but also those underlying health conditions and those comorbidities, those secondary diagnoses, essentially the context in which that happens. We also have done some sort of longer term kind of predictions. So we were making pretty good progress in the UK prior in terms of 5-year survival, still not as good as many other countries, certainly in Europe, and that's been a sort of a thorn in our side in the UK, considering actually the depth and the breadth and the provision of the NHS. But actually, assuming a 3 months of disruption, which is extremely conservative, it's then the stage shift that you're seeing in the detection of cancer. So detecting cancer later rather than earlier, and those actually coming in as emergency presentations through the ED rather than actually through an elective referral, albeit urgent referrals from a cancer sort of perspective. And certainly for certain cancers such as colorectal, we reckon that actually the pandemic could set us back nearly a decade. And you can see on this slide essentially sort of where 2020 drops in terms of our sort of development, and colorectal cancer in particular takes us sort of almost back a decade, which is really quite frightening. The data is also helping us to support the recovery. So I think the call to action that we had certainly to the chief medical officers across all 4 nations in the UK really hit home, and certainly the NHS England stage 3 recovery plan that was published last August had cancer services absolutely prioritised to restart. And I think you saw similar sort of profiles from Laura's presentation as what happened in Spain, Catalonia, around the sort of the further sort of waves of the pandemic, and it not being quite so stark as we saw during the first lockdown. So there was that sort of response. However, there's still some underlying issues that we're still sort of going through that we need to understand sort of better. I'm not going to go through all of this sort of, blowing our own trumpet, but it was really sort of, important to get those stories out there and to actually sort of turn what we actually record on a regular basis within our electronic patient record using clinical terminologies into meaningful data for population health management, but then also turning it into research. And colleagues who know me will have heard me banging on about this in the past, and it was just sort of played out sort of again. And we were delighted to win the Royal College of Physicians Research Award for original research that contributed to significant improvements in health outcomes or the quality of patient care, which comes back to that quality element. So essentially, sort of, these are the top 10 sort of impacts in terms of where it sort of hit. There are certain areas where we still, certainly from an HDIEK perspective, that we feel that, we need to actually sort of, pick up sort of from the future, particularly around patient-reported outcomes, and also sort of understanding the sort of the context and particularly for cancer of patient-held records. I work in Leeds, work at the university, also an honorary contract at Leeds Teaching Hospital, which is one of the largest teaching hospitals in the UK. And we wanted to sort of see perhaps some of the other sort of characteristics in terms of impact of age and deprivation. And actually we saw a significant reduction in proportion of patients sort of, greater than 60, not unsurprising, those people who were shielding, but also sort of, the demographics. Interestingly enough, actually, deprivation, we wondered whether, the sort of the more wealthy, sort of educated residents of Harrogate would be demanding their services rather than the sort of the poorer ends of Leeds. But actually, we haven't seen that so far coming out through the data, but we're doing much more sort of analysis. The worrying thing is really around that sort of bow wave in terms of cancer diagnosis. And we've calculated in Leeds alone, which accounts for about 1% of sort of population of cancer patients across England. Actually, if you extrapolate that up, we reckon that there's approximately 85,000 missing diagnoses in the UK. So we really need to sort of unpick that, see where they are presenting, whether they've sadly, sort of passed away, what has actually happened. So what we've been able to do is agree with our NHS Distal, which is our national body in England for data and information, the use of the National Trusted Research Environment. So within HDIEK, we're really sort of recognizing that, the future lies in trusted research environments where people can actually come into, sort of well-curated, high quality linked data in order to, and not taking it away and popping it in pockets, but actually having the governance associated with it. And so we at DataCan are the first sort of lead users of the National Cancer TRE. And you can see already, we've got access to over 12 billion rows of data and more than 50 million patients in England in order to be able to do that sort of pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and hopefully when we get to a point that is post-pandemic, that we can actually see what those sort of trends are and actually sort of inform our planning and provision for the future. Using cloud-based technology, using sort of, highly sort of accessible and tools, but also having sort of Databricks, data lake, etc. So over the next year, and we've already started this, we've set up a significant program of work looking at these 5 things: direct impact of COVID-19. This is a national level, a regional level, at a local level, so we'll be able to do all of this. Influence and associations of cancer on COVID-19 outcomes, influence and association in terms of risk factors, and we're working very closely with colleagues at Cancer Research UK and the other sort of charities sort of around that, influence on cancer medication. So we've got access to all of the prescribing within primary care, for example, and also we'll have access to the medication sort of data from a secondary care perspective. And then that direct impact of COVID-19 disease on cancer disease occurrence, which is a lot in terms of the short, medium, and long term. We've also been doing some sort of smaller studies, and in particular collaboration with some pharmaceutical companies. This is, in particular, this was a study that we've done with Roche. And that's actually recognizing that not all of these data are available sort of in either national data sets or in registration data, that actually you need to go into the electronic patient record and improve the quality and the curation of it. And this was a piece of work around triple negative breast cancer, which, you know, by nature of the fact that you don't have the opportunity to have targeted interventions from specific sort of drugs, makes it sort of, you know, much much less effective in terms of sort of treatment. And this was actually a two-centre study across Leeds and Edinburgh in Scotland. And it was, you know, very intense. We actually had to sort of push very hard in order to do that. But actually bringing those data together to actually prove that the sort of the feasibility assessment, and we're looking to roll out a much larger sort of EHR curation sort of program. Our colleagues at NHS Digital have also recently put out a call for a national project for SNOMED CT clinical information and cancer services. And I think, you know, so some of this has been the conversation that Ian and I have had over the years, is recognizing that in the UK we're still not using SNOMED enough, really, and when in order to be able to support the cancer services. And the expectation is, as part of this piece of work, which will be happening over the next sort of 6 months, is to actually do that sort of overview of the current implementation status of SNOMED and cancer services, where the information flows are, what the summary of the challenges are, making recommendations to address gaps in SNOMED subsets and associated data, recommending governance arrangements, the data, coming up with sort of data models and seeing how that actually applies to other sort of tumour sites, and then, you know, looking at the clinical content, sort of authoring maintenance sort of principles. And it, you know, this today has been, you know, hugely informative, and a lot of the stuff that people are doing sort of, you know, globally will hopefully be able to sort of take some of those benefits in the UK as well. So I think this is a really positive step. There's still much to do. And, you know, finally, the sort of COVID, like cancer, doesn't respect borders. So we've been doing quite a bit of work around with the European Cancer Organization, a lot of interest and sort of anecdotally similar situations in Europe, but the sort of the drops may be less sort of profound. We've presented some evidence to the WHO Europe Regional Committee, and one of my colleagues, Professor Mark Lawler, who's one of the Pro-Vice Chancellors of Queen's University Belfast, is co-leading the European Cancer Organisation Special Network on COVID and Cancer, and researchers in other countries are following our sort of approach in analysing real-time data. There's a 7-point plan for COVID-19 and cancer in the opening session of the European Cancer Organisation Summit, and the evidence was presented to the European Beating Cancer Committee in the European Parliament. So that's a whistle-stop tour through everything. As I said, I wanted to sort of demonstrate the sort of the end game, what we are able to do, some of the fantastic work we can, but also recognizing that actually, unless you get it right at the beginning and it goes all the way through, then essentially, you're not going to be able to achieve the outcomes that are required. So I think I'm about 4 minutes early, but there you go, Ian. Why not?
That's fine. Thank you. So yeah, thank you, Monica. So yes, you and I have had lots of conversations in the past. So I've one question via the Q&A for you, and then I have one question which is more from me, I guess. So Stefan asks, with some of the things that you're talking about, are there automated monitoring processes in place for some of these, or is everything manual? So you have a very large data set. Is there any way you can automatically keep a tag on things, or is it someone sitting there running the query all the time?
Yeah, we've certainly been doing some much more automation, particularly at a regional level. So I presented previously on the Yorkshire and Humber Care record. And what we've done from an interoperability perspective is actually use fire profiles to bring our sort of systems together. So the way that we've implemented that is that we've actually, and obviously we can put the SNOMED content in that, is actually when we're generating sort of data sets, bespoke ones, in order to be able to do the sort of analytics, is set up that subscription service so that anything that changes in the core systems can then be sort of updated. I think on the sort of the national level sort of data, that once again, it is very much dependent on the sort of the refresh rate of what is doing. We are hoping through, and we used our sort of words very sort of carefully in terms of that robust evaluation of the National Cancer sort of TRE, because actually we really do want to lift up the lid and see what's wriggling sort of underneath it and actually feed that back into the system. So I think it's by using sort of, you know, interoperability standards, using wherever possible sort of, you know, subscription services in order to be able to actually get real-time data is the way ahead. There is still quite a bit of sort of data wrangling, but actually I've been very impressed with the sort of the linkages. In the national TRE, it uses the national de-identification tool Privitar. So that provides us, uses pseudonymization and salt keys and what have you, in order to be able to actually then sort of link the data. So being able to take the sources, particularly for the COVID data, both the Pillar 1 testing, the Pillar 2, so folks who are not in the UK, Pillar 1 is essentially anybody who's in hospital and NHS staff and workers, and Pillar 2 is essentially the broader sort of community. So we've got access to both of those, and also the a lot more of the additional pandemic data sets that were created under the COPE notice. So actually, the timeliness of those is much better, but the quality is in some cases worse. So I think it is not unsurprisingly, but actually we're able to provide the feedback and it is getting much better. But we've actually been very impressed as to how easy the linkage has been, and also that actually some of the analytics that we've done both on the national data, but also as a sort of a real sanity check against our leads data, is matching within about a 10% sort of tolerance. So yeah, there's still some data wrangling going, but we're trying to get to the point where we can automate things more. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, well, it is from my perspective anyway. So I have a question. I should know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you have any links to any of the other international projects looking at cancer data collection? So things like EU CanCan, so the stuff which Sylvia's doing in Europe, where
yeah, through the European work that Mark and colleagues, particularly around the colorectal cancer, that we have definitely got close links and are working collaboratively around that. And our colorectal cancer intelligence hub, which is based at the University of Leeds, our colleagues are working with us on that as well. But our expectation is I wanted to be able to get to a point where we knew that we actually had all of the data available. And as you might imagine, you know, that's not been a particularly easy process, even for somebody as determined as me. And I've got a few arrows out of my chest, but that's okay. Pioneering this kind of stuff because it's worth it. But I think the opportunity to then move forward in terms of those larger collaborations is really sort of paramount. And actually, I was just looking through Susie Roy's slides from earlier in the week around sort of what Snomed International is doing on the research side of things, and particularly around some of the research environments and the tools. And from an HDR UK perspective, we're planning for our quinquennial review, which comes up pretty soon, and our QQ2 sort of planning. So I would absolutely like to tie in with that from an HDR UK perspective. I'm actually leading on the program and around the data quality and standards for that. So if anybody wants to get in touch, please do.
Thank you. Right, Charles, you have a raised hand.
Monica, one of the, am I on? Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that the perhaps the international friends on this call won't be so well aware of as you as me, which is that almost all primary care data now is collected using SNOMED CT. Do you think your analysis has used those elements of the primary care data, and do you think it's made a difference?
Yes, absolutely, Charles, because we've got essentially the GPES data, which is the precursor to the GD, whatever they call it, GP, DDR. So those data are now described using SNOMED. So particularly around our comorbidities work, we're actually seeing the benefits of the primary care data, absolutely. And I will be delighted to show people the output of that on a more sort of detailed sort of basis. But yeah, absolutely, it really is making a difference. Yeah.
So one of the things which Ken Lings asked from Sweden, so are cancer cases, I think you've kind of answered this in a roundabout way, but I'll ask it anyway. Are cancer cases detected through primary care, or are they collected separately and tagged for other analytics?
So we still have a cancer registration service, albeit that has recently moved from our Public Health England through into NHS Digital as of the 1st of October. So that what we tended to do is that within our hospital episode statistics, our national sort of returns that every single trust has to send through to the centre on a monthly basis, but actually happens on a weekly basis, and now certainly for emergency care happens on a daily basis. That is then augmented through tapping it by the cancer registration sort of service, tapping into to other systems to make it more complete and essentially doing that curation. But actually there is a feedback loop, particularly through our discharge summaries, which goes, back into the primary care sort of record, and through much more sort of use of electronic messaging using FHIR again, back into the GP system. So in terms of the sort of the updates for the service, although the cancer register is officially held at a central level, many of our other disease registers are actually held in our primary care sort of records. So diabetes, for example, is much more comprehensive within the primary care record. And we're also, going back to to Charles's point, is seeing much better quality of data that is actually within the primary care record, which also helps to flag up to clinical colleagues essentially where the potential is for relapse and reoccurrence and the the longitudinal component part of it. So we are seeing improvements now.
Right. So thank you, Monica, again. So a round of applause, Charles. So I'm going to hand over to Charles now, who's going to give some final thoughts, which I'm sure will be stimulating as always.
Thanks, Ian. Well, first of all, thank you to the 4 speakers. It has been truly global, and I think we've had some incredible insights, actually, of work that is done within individual countries, but with a international meaning. And we've seen of some of that actually in the chat, where after Laura's presentation, there's been a whole call for her reference sets and data lists and so on to be shared, and to act perhaps as a nidus for other national efforts in Europe and presumably elsewhere. I think that there is a challenge for us as a community, though, perhaps to keep referring back to what people are doing and not perhaps reinventing whole bits of work that have already been done. So I have a sort of slight anxiety that what's happened in Nebraska might not be reused in Europe and so on. So I think there's a challenge to me and Ian and Jane and others who actually work for SNOMED to ensure that we do share progress as effectively as possible across both the research and the clinical community. I guess my perhaps last and final point on all of this is one that Monica sort of hinted at and which I was sort of loosely exploring when I asked about primary care data. So I know that me and my colleagues in secondary care, at least in the UK, I'm a great fan and a great champion of SNOMED, as I think everybody on this call knows. But I think my colleagues in their clinics in Barts Health or elsewhere across England would think we'd all lost our minds and would have difficulty understanding what this conversation was about in many areas of medicine. And so there is, again, a really interesting challenge for us as health informaticians to get the message out to practicing clinicians at the front line about how and why the use and recording of structure in the record, and particularly the use of terminology, can make a huge difference to the health of people. We've all struggled, haven't we, over the last couple of years with dealing with misinformation around vaccination, around the effects of COVID-19 on human health and so on. And some of that could be dealt with better by ensuring that doctors use data in such a way that you could counter some of that misinformation and to feed it through into patient-held records, into patient knowledge bases in a way that might balance off the less nice effects of social media and so on. And so I think that the challenges are legion. The excitement is huge. The enthusiasm with which this community has come together in the last 3 hours in understanding how best to use terminology, I think has been absolutely superb. And I think I've rarely come to a SNOMED event where, one, there's been so much interest, there's been so much dialogue in the chat bars, and so much commitment to do things differently going forwards. So once again, thanks to everybody who came. Thanks to all the audience for sticking it out and listening through. And as I say, I think a challenge for me and Ian in a year's time in Lisbon, when we'll all come together, to have found a community of people who can talk fluently about the use of SNOMED in cancer care, in the comorbidities of cancer care, and obviously in those individual illnesses, either with or without cancer. So the challenge is great, but the enthusiasm, I think, is even greater. So thank you all so much for coming.
And I'd like to echo that thanks to all the presenters. I found all the presentations extremely good, extremely stimulating, so thank you. For those that are on the call is obviously recorded. We'll make the recordings available via YouTube after the event. So obviously you've been through it, but if you have colleagues who want to listen to either all of it or part of it, it'll be available on YouTube. In terms of the presentations for each presenter, I'll make those available on the Confluence page for this session, which most of you, I think, are aware of. If you're not, then simply go into Google, search for SNOMED and clinical engagement, and that will take you to the landing page for the clinical engagement team, and all the previous conferences, presentations are all on there. You can peruse at your leisure. So thanks again. thank you for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it. And please don't forget that the expo is on over the next 2 days. Come and join us. It will be fun. So thank you.